The crystal glasses clinked together in the private dining room at Langston and Company, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Laughter and celebratory conversation filled the space, but I barely heard any of it. My fingers gripped the stem of my champagne flute as I smiled at Mitchell Carter, the lead investor at Apex Capital, who raised his glass with genuine enthusiasm. "Here's to an exciting new chapter," he said, nodding toward me. After months of grueling negotiations, I had finally secured an $8 million investment to take my family's specialty food business to the national stage. The investors were beaming, my team was ecstatic, and my parents, well, they looked happier than I had seen them in years. "My daughter, Callie, is the heart of this company," my father said, raising his glass. "When my wife and I started Langley's Gourmet Goods 25 years ago, we never imagined it could grow into this." My mother smiled, but something flickered across her face, a hesitation I knew all too well. As the investors discussed the expansion plans I had meticulously laid out, she leaned toward me, her voice soft enough that only I could hear. "This is all very exciting, dear," she murmured. "But remember, when Daniel returns next month, he'll be the best choice for CEO. You've done an incredible job, but he has the education for this level of business." I felt my stomach turn to stone. Daniel, the golden child, my older brother, who had spent the past year gaining global experience in Europe after finishing his MBA. He barely checked in on the business I had rebuilt from the ground up. Yet here was my mother, acting as though he was the natural successor. I kept my smile in place and squeezed her hand gently. "Of course, Mom." But inside, my mind was already racing. 8 years ago, I was on the fast track to a high-powered career in finance when my father called me with devastating news. Our family business was failing. They had overextended by opening a second location, and the recession had nearly crushed them. They were 3 months from shutting down. I still remember my boss's reaction when I handed in my resignation. "You're leaving finance to sell what, Jam?" he asked incredulously. Even Daniel, still an undergrad at the time, had his doubts. "Callie, it's a sinking ship. Just let it go." But I couldn't. Langley's wasn't just a store. It was my parents' legacy. I had grown up watching them craft recipes, build relationships with suppliers, and treat customers like family. Saving, it wasn't about numbers. It was about preserving something that mattered. The first 2 years were brutal. I worked the front counter by day and pored over financials at night. I sold our second location, renegotiated supplier contracts, and modernized everything from branding to inventory systems. When we couldn't afford rent, I slept on a cot in the stockroom for 6 months. Daniel, meanwhile, graduated, took a cushy corporate job, and checked in every once in a while with half-hearted advice. My parents never seemed to mind his absence. They always insisted that his valuable experience would benefit the business someday. Meanwhile, I was the one actually saving it. Then, everything changed. A well-known food blogger stumbled upon our artisanal preserves and wrote a glowing review. Overnight, our struggling business became the hottest name in the gourmet food scene. I capitalized on that momentum, launching a subscription box service that quickly gained 20,000 subscribers. From there, I secured partnerships with 3 major gourmet grocery chains, increasing revenue by 340% in just 1 year. And yet, despite all of this, my parents still spoke of Daniel as though he was the future of the company. 8 years of proving myself, and they still saw me as the placeholder until their real successor returned. "Callie?" I blinked and realized the investors were waiting for an answer. "Apologies," I said, straightening. "Could you repeat that?" Mitchell smiled. "I was asking about your vision for the company's leadership moving forward. Your operational plan is impressive, but we want to make sure we're aligned on management." This was the moment I had been dreading and preparing for. "The leadership structure will remain as it is," I said smoothly. "I will continue as CEO, with my parents serving as brand ambassadors and advisors. Their presence helps maintain the authentic family image that our customers connect with." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother tense. Mitchell nodded, jotting something in his notebook. "And your brother?" Helen mentioned he'll be joining soon. Before I could answer, my mother chimed in, her voice warm and confident. "Daniel just completed his executive MBA at Wharton. He'll be joining the leadership team next month, bringing valuable perspectives from his consulting experience." I fought to keep my expression neutral. Daniel had spent exactly 3 weekends in the store in the past 8 years. And yet, My mother spoke as if he had been integral to our success all along. Mitchell's gaze flickered between me and my mother, clearly sensing the tension. I see. And what will his role be? I opened my mouth to respond, but once again, my mother beat me to it. Well, Daniel has always had the strongest head for business, she said, smiling. Callie has done wonderfully with the creative aspects, but Daniel understands the financial side in a way that will be crucial for this expansion. I nearly choked on my drink. I had been a financial analyst. I had restructured our entire business model. I had just secured an $8 million investment that Daniel knew nothing about. And yet, in my mother's mind, I was the creative one, while Daniel was the business expert. Mitchell exchanged a glance with Diane Morgan, another key investor. I recognized that look. It was a subtle recalculation, one I had seen too many times before. They were reassessing the deal. Mitchell set his glass down and leaned forward. Miss S. Langley, our investment is largely based on Callie's leadership. If any significant structural changes are being considered, we would need to have that discussion before moving forward. For the first time all evening, my mother looked surprised, as if it had never occurred to her that the investors weren't backing the family name, they were backing me. My father cleared his throat. Of course, we're all on the same page. Callie has built something remarkable, but the damage was already done. As dinner wound down, I watched Mitchell and Diane speaking quietly, their expressions serious. When we said our goodbyes, Mitchell shook my hand firmly. We should talk, he murmured. First thing Monday. Just you. I nodded. I knew exactly what that meant. My parents were so caught up discussing Daniel's return that they didn't notice the shift in the air. But I did. Monday was going to be very interesting. I barely slept that night. By 6:00 a.m. Saturday, I was already at my desk, buried under spreadsheets, market reports, and years of documentation. The office was eerily quiet at this hour, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. I wasn't here to sulk. I was here to prepare. I heard the jingle of keys before the door swung open. Jorge, our head of maintenance, stepped inside with his usual easygoing smile. He'd been with the company since my parents first opened shop, long enough to have seen every high and low. Miss Callie, you're here early. Big meeting coming up, I said, not looking up from my laptop. He chuckled. Another one? After that fancy dinner last night? You worked too hard, you know. I smiled despite myself. Appreciate the concern, Jorge, but this one's important. More important than $8 million? He teased, raising a brow. Maybe the most important one yet, I admitted. After he left, I grabbed my phone and dialed a number I had been avoiding for months. The groggy voice on the other end answered after 2 rings. Callie, it's 6:30 on a Saturday. You better be dying or offering me $1 million. Vivian Hayes, my former professor and longtime mentor. The one person I trusted to be brutally honest with me. I need your advice, I said, skipping pleasantries. And, possibly, your help. A pause. Then, a long sigh. Let me get coffee. Be at your office in 45. By 7:30, Vivian walked through the door, 2 coffees in hand, looking more alert than I felt. She slid one across the desk and sat down, studying me carefully. I didn't waste time. I laid out everything: the dinner, my mother's not-so-subtle remarks, the investors' reactions, and Mitchell's request to meet alone on Monday. Vivian listened without interrupting, sipping her coffee as she took it all in. When I finished, she leaned back, tapping her fingers against the cup. You've been anticipating this for years, she said. So, what do you really want? The question hung in the air, heavier than I expected. Recognition from my parents? The CEO title I had already been acting under? Or something else entirely? I want what I've earned, I said finally. And I want to stop pretending that my family values my contributions. Vivian gave a slow nod. Then it's time to stop playing defense and start playing offense. By noon, I had a new plan. I called Mitchell and arranged an emergency meeting with the investment team for Sunday morning. I also reached out to 3 people who had been with me since the early days: Daphne from marketing, Jason from operations, and Tamara from product development. If you're free tomorrow, I said, I need you in the office. They didn't hesitate. Meanwhile, my parents called twice, both times excitedly rambling about Daniel's ideas for the business. I let them go to voicemail. This weekend wasn't about Daniel. This was about securing my future with or without Langley's gourmet goods. I had barely closed my eyes when my alarm blared at 6:00 a.m. By 9:00, I was sitting in our conference room, facing Mitchell, Diane, and two other members of the Apex Capital team. Their expressions were serious, curious, but serious. "Callie," Mitchell began as they settled in, "something at that dinner set off alarms for us. We need to clarify a few things." I nodded. "You're right to be concerned." I slid a folder across the table. Page 1, the current company structure. Page 2, what it would likely look like if my parents had their way. Daniel as CEO, me pushed into a vague creative director role with no real authority. Mitchell frowned. "This isn't what we discussed during negotiations." "No," I agreed. "But it's been the unspoken plan in my family for years. No matter what I achieve, Daniel is the presumed heir." Diane flipped to the next page. "And what's this?" I took a deep breath. "My counterproposal." The room fell silent as they reviewed the document. It outlined a new company, one without my parents, without the Langley name. A fresh start where I had full control. "This is unexpected," Mitchell said finally. "You're proposing we redirect our investment to a new entity, with you at the helm?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze. "And I can prove why that's the best financial decision for all of us." I walked them through my plan. Market research, sales data, the fact that our customers connected with the quality and brand story I had built, not just the family name. "What about manufacturing relationships?" Diane asked. "Wouldn't you be starting from scratch?" I shook my head. "I personally handle those contracts. They trust me, not the Langley name." The investors listened, flipping through pages of evidence. I had worked through the night to make sure my case was airtight. Mitchell leaned back, crossing his arms. "This is impressive work for a weekend. I've had this contingency plan for 3 years," I admitted. "I always knew this day might come." He exchanged a glance with his team. "We need to conduct due diligence, but I'm inclined to move forward with your proposal with some modifications to protect all parties." Relief washed over me. "Thank you," I said. I was prepared to walk away with nothing if necessary. "That wouldn't be in anyone's best interest," Mitchell replied. "But there's one condition." I raised a brow. "You need to have an honest conversation with your parents before we finalize anything. Give them a chance to recognize what they're about to lose." I wanted to refuse. I knew exactly how that conversation would go, but he was right. I'll speak with them tonight. That evening, I drove to my parents' house with a strange sense of calm. For years, I had been fighting for recognition, trying to prove my worth through dedication and results. But now I understood no amount of success would ever change how they saw me. When I walked through the door, my parents were already in the living room. My mother was beaming. "Daniel just landed. He'll be here in the morning for his first day." I forced a smile. Perfect timing. I sat down, exhaling slowly. "We need to talk." My father's smile faltered. "Of course. What's on your mind?" I didn't soften my words. "I know you expect Daniel to take over as CEO. That's not happening." My mother blinked. "Callie, don't be dramatic." "I'm not." My voice was steady. "I've secured an investment based on my leadership. The investors are backing me, not the Langley name." My father's face fell. "Callie, this was always the plan. Daniel is the firstborn." "I've increased revenue by 3,000%, I interrupted. "I secured the $8 million investment. If you push me aside for Daniel, you lose everything." Silence. For the first time in my life, they looked genuinely afraid. "You have until tomorrow morning," I said, standing. "Decide what matters more, the business or your pride." Then I walked out, leaving them in stunned silence. Tomorrow, everything would change. I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m. on Monday, 2 hours before the investors were scheduled to meet with me. I needed the quiet, the space to steady myself before the storm hit. To my surprise, I wasn't the first one there. Daphne, Jason, Tamara, and a handful of other key employees were already in the break room, sipping coffee, speaking in hushed tones. They looked up as I entered. "What are you all doing here so early?" I asked. Daphne gave me a knowing smile. "We wanted you to know you're not alone." Jason nodded. "Whatever happens today, we're with you." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. I exhaled, pressing a hand over my chest. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means everything." Tamara crossed her arms. "We've been through too much to let some outsider waltz in and take over." "Not just an outsider, my brother." At exactly 8:30, my parents walked in. My mother was dressed as if preparing for an important presentation, her expression tense but composed. My father, always the more reserved of the two, looked like he hadn't slept much. At 8:42, Daniel strolled in. Expensive suit, confident grin, that easygoing attitude of someone who had never had to fight for his place in the world. Morning, everyone. He greeted employees with handshakes, nodding at things like he was already in charge. My mother beamed at him, pointing out different aspects of the operation as if he were a visiting dignitary rather than someone who had been absent for nearly a decade. I watched from my office, arms crossed, waiting. At precisely 9:00, the elevator doors slid open and Mitchell Carter walked in, flanked by two Apex Capital executives and two of their legal partners. The atmosphere shifted. The casual morning buzz died down. Employees glanced at one another, sensing something major was about to go down. My mother hurried forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Carter, we're so delighted you're here. I'd love to introduce you to my son, Daniel." Mitchell cut her off with a polite but firm smile. "Miss S. Langley, we're here to speak with Callie." He turned slightly. "Though I think it would be beneficial for all of you to join us in the conference room." And just like that, we were moving. The room felt charged as we took our seats. On one side of the table sat my parents and Daniel. On the other, the Apex Capital team. I sat at the head, hands folded, my expression unreadable. Mitchell opened his briefcase, laying out several documents. He glanced at my parents. "Before we begin, I want to clarify something important." My mother smiled tightly. "Of course." Mitchell's tone remained professional, but his words were sharp. Apex Capital's investment was based on Callie's leadership. Our due diligence focused on her track record, her strategic planning, and her ability to execute growth. Any significant changes to leadership structure are a material alteration to our agreement. Daniel leaned forward, flashing the confident smile that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Carter, but I can assure you that my executive MBA and consulting experience." "To do what, exactly?" Mitchell interrupted, his tone flat. "Replace the person who saved this company? The person who increased its valuation by 3,000%? The person who secured this investment in the first place?" Silence. Daniel's smile faltered for the first time. My mother's face had gone pale. My father's gaze flickered to me, realization finally settling in. Diane Morgan, one of the other Apex executives, slid a folder across the table. "We have a proposition." My parents opened it with shaky hands. Inside were two documents. The first outlined the original investment deal, now with explicit language ensuring I would remain CEO for a minimum of 5 years. Daniel would be given a non-executive role, with no direct authority over company decisions. The second document was something else entirely. A term sheet for a $10 million investment into a brand new company. One I would own outright. A company with no connection to the Langley name. My father's voice was barely above a whisper. What is this?" I met his gaze. "Insurance, in case you still don't understand what's valuable about this business." Daniel's face turned red as he snatched up the second document. "You're threatening to start a competing business? Your own family?" I stayed calm. "I'm protecting what I built." His jaw clenched. "You wouldn't do that." I leaned back in my chair. "Wouldn't I?" My mother finally spoke, her voice desperate. "Callie, you can't just walk away from your family's legacy." I inhaled deeply, steadying myself before answering. "Mom," I said, my voice calm but firm, "the business isn't the legacy. I am. Without me, this company dies. You need to decide if you want to recognize that or lose everything." The room was silent. For nearly 10 minutes, the only sounds were the shuffling of papers and the quiet, tense breathing of my parents as they examined their options. Mitchell and his team waited patiently. So did I. Finally, my father sighed deeply and pushed the first document forward. "We'll sign this one," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Callie stays as CEO." My mother's lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. Daniel looked shell-shocked, like a man watching his carefully crafted future crumble in real time. "A wise choice," Mitchell said, signaling to the legal team. And just like that, it was done. 2 hours later, the paperwork was signed, finalized, and legally binding. Daniel would take on the title of Vice President of Business Development, a position with clear boundaries and no direct influence over company strategy. My parents would transition into brand ambassador roles, stepping back from day-to-day operations. When the investors left, my parents lingered in the conference room, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Callie," my father started. I stood up. "I have a company to run," I said simply. "Excuse me." I walked out. As I stepped into the main office, employees looked up, waiting. Jason, Daphne, Tamara, all the people who had built this company alongside me. I gave a short nod. They broke into quiet, relieved smiles. The weight on my chest lifted. It was done. I was finally in control. Langley's Gourmet Goods was thriving. The national expansion was ahead of schedule, and our new product lines had exceeded sales projections by 40%. To the outside world, we looked like the perfect family success story. The reality was more complicated. My relationship with my parents was functional, polite. We spoke when necessary. I showed up at the occasional family dinner, but I no longer sought their approval. I didn't need it anymore. The betrayal had hurt, but it had also given me something priceless: clarity. I may have still carried the Langley name on my business cards, but my real legacy, that was mine alone. And that was worth more than anything. 6 months after securing my place as CEO, Langley's Gourmet Goods was thriving on paper. The national expansion was ahead of schedule. Our subscription service had doubled in size, and the investors were more than satisfied with their return. But beneath the surface, things weren't as smooth as they seemed. Family businesses are built on more than just balance sheets and profit margins. They run on trust, on shared vision, on the unspoken agreements that hold everything together. And after what had happened in that conference room, those agreements had been shattered. I had won, but I wasn't sure what I had left to hold on to. My parents still came into the office a few times a week, technically in their new roles as brand ambassadors. The reality? They spent most of their time looking over my shoulder, searching for ways to regain control. At first, it was subtle. Comments about how things used to be done. Little reminders of traditions I was supposedly abandoning. My mother dropping hints about Daniel's untapped potential in front of employees. Then it got bolder. My father started questioning minor financial decisions in front of staff, planting doubt where there was none. My mother tried to insert herself into product meetings, despite the fact that she had barely been involved in development for years. And Daniel? Daniel was a problem. Technically, he was the vice president of business development, a meaningless title, designed to give him something to do while keeping him out of my way. Except he didn't want to be out of my way. Every time I turned around, he was there challenging decisions, undermining my authority, pushing his own initiatives without approval. One afternoon, I walked into the break room and overheard him talking to a junior employee. "She's good at keeping the old customers happy," he was saying, voice casual, "but she doesn't really understand how to scale a business." I stepped into the room. "I'm sorry, Daniel. What was that?" He turned, all fake innocence. "Oh, hey, Callie. I heard what you were just." I met his gaze, my voice cool. "If you have concerns about my leadership, take them to the investors. If you want to keep playing CEO in the break room, I can have HR adjust your role accordingly." The employee awkwardly excused himself. Daniel scoffed. "You're seriously going to pull rank over a conversation?" I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "No, Daniel. I'm pulling rank because I am the CEO. And if you want to keep collecting a paycheck, you'll remember that." I walked away before he could answer. That night, I started making a new plan, one that didn't include him. By the time the investors arrived for our quarterly review, I was ready. The meeting started smoothly. Mitchell and Diane were pleased with the numbers, impressed with our expansion, and excited about the next phase of growth. Then Mitchell sat back, lacing his fingers together. "There is one concern we need to discuss," he said, glancing at me. "Your brother." I didn't flinch. "Go on." "We've received complaints about his behavior stepping outside of his role, pushing unauthorized projects, making employees uncomfortable with his attempts to assert control." Diane frowned. "We need to be clear, Callie. We backed you, not a family-run committee." I nodded. "I understand." Mitchell watched me carefully. "Then what's your plan?" I already had the paperwork prepared. I slid a folder across the table. "Daniel will be transitioning out of the company." Diane raised a brow. "You've already made the decision." "I have," I said firmly. "And I don't intend to let this drag out." Mitchell glanced at the exit package I had put together. "This is generous," he admitted. "But he's your parents' son. This won't go over well." "I know." And I was ready for it. I called a meeting that evening. My parents, Daniel, and I sat in the same conference room where everything had changed 6 months earlier. I slid the paperwork across the table. Effective immediately. Daniel is leaving the company. My mother's face drained of color. "Excuse me?" My father's mouth tightened. "You don't have the authority to make that decision on your own." I tilted my head. "Actually, I do." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Wow, that's how it is, huh?" I looked at him. "Yes." My mother pushed the papers away like they were poison. "This is your brother, and this is my company." The room was thick with tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavy. My mother turned to my father, eyes pleading. "Say something," she whispered. My father exhaled slowly, looking at me with something close to resignation. "Is there anything we can say to change your mind?" "No." Daniel shook his head, standing abruptly. Unbelievable. He stormed out. My mother stayed seated, staring at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. "I hope this was worth it," she said quietly. I met her gaze, unflinching. "I do too." She stood, turned, and followed Daniel out. My father lingered for just a moment longer before nodding stiffly and walking away. For the first time since I took over, I was truly alone in this company. And for the first time since I took over, I felt free. The silence from my family was deafening. No calls, no texts, no check-ins from my mother asking about new product launches, no passive-aggressive emails from my father nitpicking financial reports. And Daniel? He was gone. I heard through mutual contacts that he had landed another corporate job, something cushy with a big title, but little actual responsibility, the kind of job he had always been good at. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt nothing. One afternoon, as I sat in my office reviewing reports, there was a soft knock at the door. George, the maintenance manager, peeked in. "Miss Callie?" I smiled. "Hey, George, what's up?" He hesitated, just wanted to say. "The company feels different now." But in a good way. I raised a brow. "Oh?" He nodded. "Lighter. Like we all know who's actually in charge." I sat back, considering that. "Thank you, Jorge. That means a lot." He grinned and left. I stared at the closed door, something loosening in my chest. For so long, I had been fighting, proving myself, defending my place, bracing for the next battle. But maybe, finally, the fight was over. Maybe now I could just lead. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that was enough. Cutting Daniel out of the company had been necessary. There was no question about that. But the aftermath still weighed on me. My parents had always been distant when it came to acknowledging my success. But now it was something else entirely. A cold silence. They weren't just disappointed, they were hurt. For years, I had tried to prove that I deserved my seat at the table, that I was more than just a placeholder, until Daniel decided to care. But after that meeting, it was clear there was no winning them over. They would never see me as enough. And honestly, that realization was freeing. Because now, I could finally stop waiting for their approval. Without Daniel's interference and my parents' constant second-guessing, the company finally felt like mine. Decisions were made faster. Departments ran smoother. Morale was higher. For the first time, people weren't hesitating, waiting for my parents to swoop in and override me. They trusted my leadership. Sales were up 20% over projections. The new product line had gone viral on social media, with influencers raving about the quality. Our partnerships with national grocery chains expanded ahead of schedule. And yet, even with all this success, I still found myself staring at my phone some nights, half expecting a message from my mother. It never came. She used to call me at least once a week sometimes to check in, mostly to offer suggestions I didn't ask for. But since that final meeting with Daniel, nothing. And I refused to be the one to reach out first. 3 months passed. Then, on a quiet Friday afternoon, my assistant poked her head into my office. "Callie," she said, looking unsure. "Your father's on line 1. I blinked. My father rarely called. When he did, it was about business. But there was nothing urgent on the agenda. I hesitated for only a second before picking up. "Hi, Dad." A pause. Then his steady voice came through. "Callie, how are you?" I leaned back in my chair. "Busy, but good." "What's going on?" A beat of silence. Then, the last thing I expected. "I'd like to have dinner." I frowned. "Dinner?" "Yes." Another pause. "Just us." I studied the phone, as if I could read his true intentions through the receiver. "All right," I said finally. "When and where?" He picked a quiet restaurant, one we had gone to a handful of times when I was younger, back when business was simpler and our family still felt whole. I arrived early, half wondering if he'd change his mind. But at exactly 7:00 p.m., he walked in. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. We made small talk over drinks, but I could tell he had something on his mind. Finally, he sighed, setting down his glass. "I don't agree with how things played out." I tensed. "If you called me here to rehash Daniel's exit..." "No," he interrupted. "I know that was inevitable. But your mother," he exhaled. "She's taking it harder than I expected." I didn't respond. He studied me for a long moment. "You're angry at us." I gave a short, humorless laugh. "Took you this long to figure that out?" He didn't flinch. "You had every right to fight for your place." I just wish it hadn't come at the cost of our family. Something in my chest tightened, but I forced myself to stay steady. "Dad, it was never a fight for my place. It was a fight to keep what I had already built." He nodded slowly. "I see that now." I waited, but he didn't offer an apology. Maybe he didn't know how. Or maybe, deep down, he still believed Daniel should have been the one leading the company. After a long silence, he spoke again. "Your mother wants to reach out," he admitted, "but she doesn't know how." I swallowed the sharp retort on my tongue. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a test. If I said nothing, things would stay the way they were, cold, distant, broken. If I made the first move, it would be seen as me conceding. I wasn't sure which was worse. That night, I lay awake staring at my ceiling, Dad's words circling my mind. I had always wanted my mother to recognize my success, to see me, but was it even worth it anymore? Maybe we had been too broken for too long. Or maybe I had spent so much time proving my worth that I never stopped to consider what came next. The next morning, I did something I never thought I would. I picked up my phone, and I called my mother. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, finally, "Callie?" She sounded surprised, maybe even relieved. I took a breath. "Hi, Mom." A pause. Then, softly, "Hi, sweetheart." Maybe this wasn't the end of our story after all. Rebuilding wasn't easy. My mother and I were never going to have the perfect relationship. But over time, things got better. She stopped pushing Daniel's name into conversations. I stopped waiting for validation that would never come. We found a new balance, one where I was CEO and she was just my mother. Daniel and I, though, that bridge had burned to ash, and I was okay with that. Some things weren't meant to be repaired. Langley's was bigger than ever. Our flagship product line had gone international. Revenue had doubled since the investment. But more than that, for the first time, I felt bigger. I wasn't just the woman who had saved my family's company. I was the one who had rewritten its future. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back, only forward. A year had passed since I secured my position as CEO. 12 months of relentless work, scaling the company, expanding our reach, proving to myself more than anyone that I deserved to be exactly where I was. Langley's was no longer just a family business. It was a brand that stood on its own, thriving under my leadership. Investors were happy. Our growth was undeniable. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for the next battle. I had already won. But winning didn't mean there weren't scars. My relationship with my mother had found a strange, delicate balance. She didn't push Daniel's name anymore. I didn't expect her to suddenly become the kind of parent who could express pride without condition. We spoke occasionally. Family dinners were no longer unbearable. It was enough. With my father, things were simpler. He had accepted reality, accepted me, even if he never said the words out loud. In his own way, he had let go of the old vision of the company and allowed me to carry it forward. Daniel, he was still a sore subject. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he walked out of that conference room. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he had landed another high-level job, something with a fancy title, but little real responsibility. He was doing what he did best, looking important, without doing the work. And honestly, that was no longer my problem. One crisp autumn morning, I stood in the middle of our brand new warehouse facility, 70,000 square feet of streamlined logistics, automated order fulfillment, and the next step in Langley's expansion. Crazy, isn't it? Daphne said beside me, arms crossed as she admired the space. Remember when we couldn't even afford a storage unit? I laughed, vividly. Jason walked up, tablet in hand. Numbers are in. This new system cuts fulfillment time by 40%. Faster shipping, happier customers. Tamara grinned. It's almost like someone running this place knows what they're doing. I shook my head, smiling. Let's not get carried away. But deep down, I knew the truth. I did know what I was doing. And I wasn't just running the company anymore, I was building something bigger than what my family had ever imagined. The following week, I received an unexpected email. Subject, congratulations, from Mitchell Carter. I clicked it open. Callie, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge what you've built. You didn't just save this company, you transformed it. We invested in you for a reason, and you've more than proven us right. Excited to see where you take things next. I exhaled slowly, rereading the words. For so long, I had been fighting to be seen, to be recognized for what I had built. And here it was, not from my family, not from people who had expected me to fail, but from the people who had believed in me from the start. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of that realization settling over me. This wasn't just a victory. It was mine. Langley's would always carry my family's name. But its success, that belonged to me, not to my parents, not to Daniel, not to the outdated expectations that once tried to box me in. I had rewritten the rules. And as I looked out at the thriving company I had built, I knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. Story 2. She won't be left alone by you. My voice cracked in terror as I yelled into my phone. I was having trouble breathing since my heart was beating so quickly. Just seconds before, I had heard my daughter Melody's panicked voice, and the hospital room felt abruptly smaller, the walls closing in. Grandma, Grandpa, and Mommy simply drove off. I'm by myself here. Over the phone, she had cried. They stated I'm old enough to be left alone, and that they're attending Uncle Peter's party. I'm afraid. Christina Harper is my name. Tina. To all those who are acquainted with me. And after losing my husband, Michael, to a vehicle accident 3 years ago, I am a 36-year-old widow, doing my best to raise my 10-year-old daughter. Since the passing of her father, Melody has battled anxiety. I occasionally wake up with nightmares because I'm afraid I could experience the same thing. Now, by leaving her when she needed protection, my in-laws had validated her worst fears. The majority. Tina, you're going overboard. Gerald, my father-in-law, snorted into the phone. She must become more resilient. She is no longer a baby. In a few hours, we will return. A couple of hours? I almost let out a yell. She is 10. Leaving a child that age alone is against the law. Return right now to my residence. We're halfway to Peter's already. Barbara, my mother-in-law, added her voice. The entire family will be present for his 60th birthday. Melody was also invited, but she declined. She can choose to do it. What I was hearing was unbelievable. After an emergency gallbladder operation, I found myself unable to leave the hospital. And because a party was more essential, they had left their sole grandchild, my kid, behind. Right now, I'm giving my neighbor Janet a call to see how Melody is doing. My voice trembled with anger as I spoke. And you will never again have unattended access to my kid once I leave tomorrow. Barbara replied dismissively. As usual, you're being dramatic, Tina. Michael would have gotten it. It's you who is softening her. The last straw was using my late spouse against me. We're done talking. Don't come near my residence. I quickly contacted Janet, who lived across the street, after hanging up. Thankfully, she responded straight fast and said she would go check on Melody right away. I knew this was only the beginning as I hung up, shaking with dread and rage. There was a terrible ache in my chest, not from the operation, but rather from this profound betrayal by those who were meant to assist me in safeguarding my most valuable assets. My parenting had always been undermined by Michael's parents, but this went too far. I made a self-promise to be different with my own family, because I didn't have constant supervision growing up. I met Michael in college. I was pursuing a degree in education while he was studying engineering. At the age of 26, I gave birth to Melody, and we were contentedly constructing our lives together. Gerald and Barbara, however, never really liked me. They made subtle remarks about my parenting and housekeeping, believing their son had married below him. Rhythm. Michael served as a barrier between us and always stood up for me. However, that thin barrier vanished after his death. For years, the tension had been increasing. Every family get-together turned into a labyrinth of unwanted advice and passive-aggressive remarks. "Tina, she's too attached to you." Melody would cling to my leg as Barbara spoke. With me, Michael was never like that. We instilled independence in him at a young age, which is why. "And you're weakening her," Gerald would add. Despite these difficulties, I made an effort to keep them and Melody together. I felt that having grandparents in her life was crucial since they were the only thing that connected her to her father. For Melody's sake, I swallowed my pride, nodded in agreement with their criticisms, and maintained the peace. I hurried to the emergency room 3 days ago and woke up with terrible stomach ache. I was diagnosed with acute colic by the doctors, cystitis. I had to get my gallbladder removed right away. I was worried about Melody. I phoned everyone I knew, but Janet's work schedule only allowed her to assist part-time, and my closest friends were out of town. I contacted Gerald and Barbara in despair. They consented to spend the 3 days I would be in the hospital at our home, apparently pleased to assist. As I went into surgery, I felt a wave of relief, knowing that Melody would be taken care of. I even felt bad about ignoring them for so many years. You see, Tina, in times of difficulty, family is what counts. Barbara had remarked so while she prepared my hospital stay overnight bag. Despite our disagreements, we are here when it matters. I trusted her. I entrusted them with my most valuable possession. When I phoned to check in yesterday, everything appeared to be going well. Melody sounded a little reserved, but I thought it was because she was missing me. There wasn't any indication that they would opt to forego my daughter, their grandchild, for a party today. As I waited for Janet to return my call, I came to the realization that this was more than a single instance of poor judgment. I had been oblivious to the danger, and this was who they really were. After 5 minutes, Janet phoned back. Now I'm with Melody. She gave me comfort. She's agitated, but well. She is currently eating cookies with my kid at my place after I brought her here. She can stay with me until tomorrow, when you are released. I felt a wave of relief. I'm not sure how to express my gratitude, Janet. Don't thank me, she firmly responded. They committed the crime of child abandoning. You must report this, Tina. I paused. They are her grandparents, Michael's parents. Additionally, they left a 10-year-old youngster alone at a party. Janet's tone became stern. You underwent urgent surgery. What if things had gone wrong? What if tomorrow you are unable to return home? She was correct. I felt as though I had been physically struck by the possibility of what may have occurred. What if the fire had occurred? What if Melody had suffered harm? What if there had been an intruder? That night, from my hospital bed, I made a painful call to Child Protective Services. The social worker took down my statement in a gentle but serious tone. This wasn't just a family dispute, she clarified. Child endangerment was evident in this instance. She clarified that we would have to look into and record this incident. According to state law, leaving a kid at that age is considered neglect. My phone rang again as soon as I hung up. Gerald was the one. What on earth? Tina? A federal agency called us just now and said they needed to interview us about Melody. What did you say to them? The reality. My voice was remarkably steady as I answered. That when I was in the hospital, you left my kid to attend a party. It wasn't some crazy party. It was a family get-together. She was also completely safe. Gerald, she was afraid. Since her father, she has struggled with anxiety. You abandoned her after your kid passed away. This is absurd, he yelled. Her grandparents are us. We are entitled to certain rights. Something broke inside of me. Rights? You believe you have rights when you leave a youngster alone? Gerald, you have obligations that you totally disregarded, similar to how you left. Rhythm. Barbara is sobbing as a result of your actions, trying to make me feel bad, he said, following everything that we have done for you. Apart from criticizing and undermining me, what have you done specifically? Ever since Michael passed away? Now, instead of shivering with dread, my voice was quivering with wrath. I apologized to Barbara for her distress, but I'm more worried about my traumatized kid. Tomorrow, I'll be at home. Furthermore, neither of you should come to my residence. He thundered. You can't stop us from seeing Melody. Observe me. After responding, I hung up. My hospital room seemed chilly and deserted that night. I questioned whether I had overreacted as I looked at the ceiling. However, Melody's terrified voice could be heard each time I closed my eyes. I'm alone here, Mommy. No, I hadn't gone too far. I had been too patient for too long, if anything. The next morning, I was released from the hospital. I was taken up by Janet, who told me about Melody's night. When we were driving home, Janet muttered that she had a hard time falling asleep, asked often whether you were indeed returning home today. My heart hurt. Did she elaborate on what transpired? Janet paused. She said that they had already abandoned her. I almost choked. What? They apparently left her house for around an hour yesterday to go grocery shopping. They told her not to call you while you were recuperating, so she didn't. I felt a wave of white-hot rage. Twice they had left her and tricked her into not speaking up. Melody sprang into my arms and clung to me like she always did when we got to Janet's house. Following Michael's passing, "Mom, you've returned." In my shoulder she wailed. I said, "I'm here, sweetie," holding her close while battling the pain from my surgical incision. I sincerely apologize for what transpired. I reset the codes on our electronic door locks later that afternoon, after we had returned to our house. Even though I was still recovering from surgery, I was determined to change the physical locks, so I called a locksmith. Melody's eyes were wide as she watched me. "Our grandparents are returning." Quietly, she asked. I carefully considered my words as I sat next to her on the couch. "No, honey, not for a while. Their actions were dangerous and incorrect. I was acting like a baby," they said. Melody muttered. "Daddy wouldn't be proud of me being so afraid," according to my grandfather. My throat grew enraged. It was unacceptable to use Michael against our daughter. "Your father would be very pleased with you," I spoke firmly. "When you felt unsafe, you had the courage to call me." That was precisely the proper course of action. By evening, Gerald, Barbara, and even Michael's brother Peter were texting and calling me nonstop. At last, I took Peter's call. "You have to relax, Tina," he began. "Mom and Dad are inconsolable. They claim that you changed the locks and reported them to child services. On 2 occasions, they left my daughter Peter behind." I sounded like ice. "To attend your birthday celebration, they left a 10-year-old alone." "See, they were wrong," I interrupted. "A mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pick someone up from soccer practice. Deliberately leaving a child alone after being trusted with her care is a choice. They're family. Tina, Melody's grandparents. Being family doesn't give them the right to endanger my child," I replied. "Would you leave your kids alone at that age?" His silence was telling. "That's what I thought," I continued. "I filed a formal report, and yes, I've changed the locks. They're not welcome in my home until they acknowledge what they did and take steps to earn back my trust." After hanging up, I found 3 voicemails from Barbara, each progressively more hostile. "Tina, this is absurd. Gerald and I have never done anything but love Melody." The first one began the second. "You're turning our granddaughter against us. Michael would be horrified by your behavior." And the third left just minutes ago. "We're consulting with a lawyer about grandparents' rights. You can't keep us from seeing Melody. You've gone too far this time." I deleted them all, hands shaking. I knew the thread about grandparents' rights might not be empty. They had the resources for legal action, but I also knew I had documentation of their neglect. And protecting Melody was worth whatever battle lay ahead. As I tucked Melody into bed that night, she looked up at me with teary eyes. "Am I in trouble with Grandma and Grandpa?" "No, sweetheart," I assured her. "They're the ones who made a bad choice, not you. You're safe now." But when I kissed her goodnight, I worried if any of us were genuinely secure from what was coming next. The next morning, I received an email from CPS saying they'd launched an investigation. The social worker, Miss Patterson, would be questioning all parties involved, commencing with the house visit that afternoon. The email also contained links concerning kids' safety and family therapy. I was escorting Melody to the bus station when my phone called again. Barbara's number. I refused the call, but a text came immediately. "We're coming over at noon to speak. This has gone far enough." My palms shook as I texted back. "Do not come to my residence. I will call the cops if you arrive up unannounced." 3 dots appeared, faded, then appeared again before her response came through. "You wouldn't dare try me." I wrote back after seeing Melody safely on board the school bus. I reported possible undesirable guests by calling the non-emergency police line. When I described the CPS investigation and said I would have a patrol car drive by 11:55 at noon, the officer seemed understanding. Gerald's SUV arrived in my driveway, as promised. They marched up to my door, and I observed from the front window. Barbara's expression was determined. When they discovered that their key would not fit the new lock, Gerald became enraged. As Gerald banged on the door, Barbara kept ringing the doorbell. I didn't open it. Rather, the first used the video doorbell to communicate. "Don't come," I said. "Leave my property, please." "This is absurd." The camera was yelled at by Gerald. "Seeing our granddaughter is a right. You have no right to remain on my property after I've asked you to go, and your granddaughter is in school." "We've informed the cops." Just like clockwork, a patrol car arrived. I observed through the glass as the police casually walked up and started talking to Gerald and Barbara. Gerald made frantic gestures towards my house, his face getting redder. They eventually returned to their SUV and drove off, giving my door one more stare. The policeman softly knocked. "Harper, miss. Now they're gone. Is it your intention to formally announce the situation?" I ushered him in and gave him the rundown. The CPS report, the abandonment, and their appearance. Even though I specifically asked not to attend, he made notes, told me they wouldn't be returning today, but said if the harassment persisted, I would want to think about getting a temporary restraining order. I sat on my couch after he went, exhausted both mentally and physically. I realized I hadn't taken my pain medicine when my eyes throbbed at the sight of my operation. In the middle of all the confusion that morning, my phone rang once more. It was Jessica, Peter's wife, this time. "What's happening, Tina?" "Mom and Dad just phoned Peter, sobbing, and said they were removed out of your house by the cops." I let out a sigh. I specifically instructed them not to attend, and they showed up without an invitation. They were only asked to leave by the cops. "You're going too far, don't you think?" Jessica inquired. "They made a mistake, but it put my child in risk." I cut you off. "If your sons were 10 years old, would you have left them alone?" Jessica paused. "Well, no. However, don't expect me to put up with anything you wouldn't put up with for your own kids." I hung up and went to Facebook, where my alerts were overflowing. Barbara had posted a lengthy, self-pitying statement about being wrongfully accused of negligence and kept away from our beloved grandchild. She tagged a number of relatives, who were now leaving perplexed and worried comments. Although reading her public misrepresentation of events made me physically sick, there were some insightful remarks mixed in with the condolences for Barbara. "Hold on. Did you truly abandon Melody throughout Tina's hospital stay?" "That sounds incorrect." "Did you not attend Peter's party that evening? Was Melody also present?" The truth was beginning to come to light. They were trying to steer the story, but I wasn't prepared for the significant plot surprise that was developing. The family was starting to doubt their account of what had happened. 3 days later, while Melody was at school, Miss Patterson from CPS sat in my living room, completing her interview with me. "There is enough evidence to support your claim of child neglect, based on our investigation thus far, including our conversations with your in-laws," she stated, going over her notes. "Your in-laws have acknowledged leaving your daughter alone twice, but they maintain that it was brief and that she was secure through the whole ordeal." "Now what?" I inquired, anxiety mixed with relief. "The following week, we will finish our report. Even though there are no criminal charges associated with this, it will be documented in case there are any more occurrences." She stopped and gave me a close look. "Have you given family counseling any thought? If you want to let them back into your lives in the future, it might be beneficial to set limits." I said, "I'm not sure I do. Or not in the same manner, anyhow." I opened my email after she departed and saw a message from an unfamiliar lawyer. The subject line chilled me to the bone. "Gerald and Barbara Miller are represented. Regarding the rights of grandparents to visit." I opened it, my hands trembling. The letter was written clearly yet formally. In order to legally seek visiting rights with Melody, Gerald and Barbara had hired legal counsel. It claimed that I was alienating them without cause, citing their deep and meaningful relationship with their granddaughter. Moving too fast still caused pain from my surgery incision. An ongoing reminder of the day my in-laws put a party ahead of my daughter's security. I sent the email to my friend Elaine, a lawyer, and asked her opinion. In a matter of minutes, she gave me a call. First, she said, "Don't freak out. Secondly, their hand is being overplayed. Grandparents' rights cases are notoriously hard to win, particularly when there is an active CPS neglect finding. If it comes to that, I'd be pleased to act as your representative. Thank you." My voice broke as I spoke. How they have completely turned this around is beyond me. They frequently change the story by pretending to be the victims or by refusing to take responsibility, Elaine said. However, the evidence is in your favor, Tina. Melody and I were having dinner that night when the doorbell rang. Peter was standing there by himself, looking uneasy, when I looked at the video feed. After a moment of hesitation, I opened the door. "Can we have a conversation?" Quietly, he asked. I opened the door for him. In the dining room, keeping an eye on Melody, I talked to the sister of Jessica. He started to sit rigidly on my couch's edge. She works as a psychologist for kids. She claimed that what Melody's parents did was completely out of place and might have caused her trauma. He combed his hair with his hand. I didn't want to think they would act in such a careless manner, nor did I. I spoke quietly. I trusted them with her care because of this. Peter appeared to be in real distress. When they arrived at my gathering, I was unaware that Melody was by herself. They explained to everyone that she wasn't with them because you had arranged for other care. I was taken aback by this fresh insight. They told the whole family lies. I'm afraid so. He turned to Melody, who was nervously observing us from the dining room. Could I talk to her? I apologize for not personally checking up on her. I nodded, and Peter and Melody had a gentle conversation for a few minutes, during which time Melody began to relax. Before departing, he looked to me again. I've instructed Mom and Dad to drop the legal threats. Jessica and I won't support them if they continue this way. His look was grim. Michael wouldn't have stood for this, and neither should we. I felt a startling lightness as I shut the door behind him. I was afraid that the family alliance was breaking up. It was because the truth was finally coming to light, not because of what I had done. I got an SMS from Barbara that evening. We must have a conversation without solicitors. The next stage of this battle appeared to be on the horizon, but I felt like I wasn't battling alone for the first time. I sat across from Gerald and Barbara in my living room a week later. My legal friend Elaine sat next to me, and their lawyer, Mr. Bradshaw, who had a severe appearance, sat on each side of them. Days of negotiations had resulted in a formal agreement between us at the coffee table. Since she had come into my house, Barbara had not talked to me directly. Her red-rimmed eyes were rebellious. Gerald appeared to be getting older. Somehow, the assurance that had always been a part of him significantly faded. Professionally, let's go over the terms one last time, Elaine remarked. The Millers admit that leaving Melody alone was a poor decision. Before they resume unsupervised visits with Melody, they agree to finish 3 family therapy sessions and 6 sessions of a grandparenting education program. Mr. Bradshaw gave a rigid nod. Additionally, Ms. Harper consents to allow supervised visits in the meantime and dismiss the CPS case, beginning with 2 hours at neutral venues twice a month. I verified those phrases by looking at my in-laws personally. This has nothing to do with punishment. It's about safety, Melody, and making sure that this doesn't happen again. Gerald cleared his throat. As they scribbled their signatures on the page, we will sign, even if we still believe this has been exaggerated. I was relieved that the fight was over and hopeful that healing could start, but I didn't feel victorious or satisfied. When they were gone, I saw Melody sitting on her bed with the picture of Michael she kept on her bedside table in her hand. Our grandparents are still upset with me. Her voice was small as she requested. I put my arm around her shoulders and sat next to her. Sweetheart, they were never truly angry with you. They are depressed about the state of affairs, but we will all cooperate to improve it. Will I see them again? Indeed. But for a while, things would be a little different, I told her. To ensure that everyone feels appreciated and protected, we're establishing some new guidelines. 3 months later, Melody demonstrated how to use the tablet she had received for her birthday to Gerald, while I sat on a seat in the park. Barbara sat close by and paid attention as Melody described a game she liked. Melody was called in by Peter and Jessica's boys while they played on the swings. Although challenging, the family therapy sessions were essential. Barbara and Gerald had been protective at first. However, the therapist expertly led us through discussions about respect, limits, and the trauma that Michael's death had given us all. The influence of the grandparenting classes had been much more significant. During our most recent therapy appointment, Barbara acknowledged that they had been raising Melody in the same manner as they had their sons in the 1980s, anticipating her independence, maybe too early, and putting more emphasis on toughness than emotional support. We were mistaken. The phrases she had used were obviously challenging for her. The world has changed. Since children are unique, we must also be unique. A perfect reconciliation was not achieved. Tension still existed at times, instances where the resurgence of ancient patterns was threatened. However, there was advancement. Genuine, significant advancement that was especially advantageous to music. Janet texted me, and my phone chimed. "How are things going?" "Better than imagined," I said with a smile. In fact, they are paying attention to her. Janet was now a member of the vast support system I had established for Melody. I had discovered the dangers of depending too much on one source of assistance. Melody now had Janet, Peter, and Jessica, my friend Elaine, and a number of other reliable adults in her life, in addition to Gerald and Barbara. I experienced a range of feelings when I saw my daughter laugh at something Gerald said. It wasn't the vengeful gratification I had previously envisioned, but rather something more worthwhile. The assurance that I had kept my kids safe while maintaining her ties to her father's side of the family. This was the definition of true triumph. Making relationships healthy for all parties involved rather than ruining them. Story 3, Rebecca, you're leaving your family behind. My workplace was silent until my mother's voice rang loudly over the phone. I could already feel the strain building as I squeezed the bridge of my nose. "I've told you this 100 times, Mom. I can't continue to save Brian. He is 30 years old. He must accept accountability for his own actions." Her reply was quick, incisive, and filled with the same accusations of guilt that I had heard a million times before. "He is your sibling. Family members are meant to support one another." I took a quick look at my desk's nicely arranged papers, memories of the tremendous hours I put in to keep myself stable. "Mom, I've been there for him for years. It has nothing to do with family. It has to do with his lack of concern. He wants me to clean up the mess again after he squandered all of his cash. I'm Rebecca, and I've been the family's responsible member for as long as I can remember. I grew up quickly when my dad died, when I was 12 years old, taking on more than most children my age ever had to. By now, though, my brother Brian always had a way of sliding. Despite working part-time at a convenience shop at the age of 30, he was still able to spend all of his savings on pricey devices. When his landlord threatened to evict him, he took unaffordable trips and nights out. My mother didn't inquire. She wanted me to pay his rent. I declined. That choice threw my mom and Brian into a complete meltdown. I woke up to a notice on my phone 2 days later. When I entered Facebook and read a lengthy message from my mother, my heart fell. Unfortunately, not everyone thinks that family should remain together. Some would sooner forsake their own blood than lend a helping hand. It's unfortunate when family values are subordinated to greed. I'm genuinely let down. People the first hadn't seen in years left remarks, expressing condolences and scolding me for being callous or self-centered. Then there came the post from Brian. I never imagined my own sister would abandon me, but I suppose she values money over her family. I know who truly has my back, at least. Thank you, Mother. The treachery hurt more than the words did. To everyone we knew, they were portraying me as a villain, fabricating the tale to portray myself as callous. Setting my phone down, I gazed out the window, a simmering anger under the surface. They publicly shamed me for setting limits as a kind of retaliation for all the sacrifices I had made for them over the years. But I made a choice when the rage subsided into something more pronounced. I was prepared to fight back if they wanted to make this a public show. I couldn't get rid of the rage that was running through me after viewing those Facebook posts. After my dad went away, I made a concerted effort to be the trustworthy person to look after the family. However, this was excessive. With my laptop open in front of me, I sat down at my kitchen table and mentally relived the last several years. How many times had I intervened on Brian's behalf? There are too many to count. When he stopped coming up for work 2 years ago, he lost his job. Until he discovered another one, I paid his bills. I gave him the money to fix his car when it broke down, only to discover later that he had used it to purchase concert tickets. And he immediately turned to internet shopping and expensive trainers with the money he borrowed to get back on his feet. Even Brian's carelessness wasn't the worst part. It was my mother's steadfast support for him. Boys are not like other people. Every time I brought it up, she would say, all he needs is time to get his act together. Years of justifications have passed since then. She had gone from defending me to openly demonizing me after those Facebook remarks. I opened my email with the intention of answering a question about my job, but I was unable to concentrate. I was unable to go past the knot in my gut. It was enough. I made a call to a lawyer later that night. I described the circumstances. I described the posts and the harm they had done to my reputation, my voice trembling with annoyance. I said, I can't allow them get away with this. I was scarcely able to control my rage. The attorney attentively listened before answering. Although defamation lawsuits can be complex, you have the right to take action if their posts have seriously harmed you on a professional or emotional level. Let's begin by obtaining proof. With a mix of relief and rage, I hung up the phone. Someone was on my side at last. However, as I collected screenshots of the posts, I had a thought. Brian and I each received an inheritance from my dad that was meant to be safeguarded until we turned 25. It hadn't occurred to me in years, assuming that my share was securely stored in an account. My curiosity overcame me. The next day, I gave the lawyer another call. Could you check into my inheritance while we're at it? I simply want to confirm that everything is in order. Of course, the attorney said. That request was going to reveal a far greater betrayal than a few Facebook postings, although I was unaware of it at the time. I got an email that made me shiver a week after I had phoned the attorney. Results of the Red Inheritance investigation are the topic line. I attentively read the summary after clicking on it. My attorney had learned that Brian had been taking money out of what should have been my share of the inheritance for the previous 5 years. Up until my 25th birthday, my mother had been in charge of the account. However, it appeared that Brian had acquired it in some way and had been using it often ever since. As I flipped over the page, my hands shook. Thousands of money were lost. Who knew what I had done with money I didn't even realize I possessed? My lawyer's voice was stern but calm when I phoned him for further information. Your sibling seems to have entered the account without your consent. It is obviously stolen. Much of what was rightly yours has been stolen by him. I tried to take in what he was saying while leaning back in my chair. How did this occur? For years, my mother managed the account. Nothing regarding Brian having access was ever mentioned by her. She might not have known. That's what the lawyer said. She could have trusted him to handle things appropriately, though. It's a major violation in any case. The ramifications were astounding. Not only had Brian been stealing from me, but my mother had also allowed it to happen that evening, whether she knew it or not. I was sitting at my kitchen table, looking at the financial documents that I had received from my lawyer. Every transaction was like being slapped across the face. Electronics, trips, and concert tickets. Things that I had found difficult to pay for myself when Brian was living off of my money. All of a sudden, the Facebook post seemed like the least of my issues. This was no longer only about humiliating in public. The whole foundation of my family was betrayed by this. I considered phoning my mother at that very moment to demand answers, but I restrained myself. There would just be more deflection and guilt-tripping if you confronted her without a plan. I emailed my lawyer instead. What will happen next? I inquired. I decided I wasn't going to let this go by the time I went to bed. I had been the one who made sacrifices and maintained harmony for years, while Brian got away with everything. No more. One thought kept coming to me as I switched off the light. They're going to discover just who they're up against. I spoke with my lawyer about the next steps in his office the following day. As I presented all the information he had discovered, the cramped space felt oppressive. The inheritance isn't the only issue here. I spoke aggressively. My mother and Brian have gone too far. Even though those Facebook posts were awful, I now learn that he has been defrauding me for years. I want to do something about it. Take serious action. My attorney gave a nod. His face was composed and businesslike. First, we will file a defamation lawsuit based on the posts on social media. However, we will need to pursue a different case in relation to the inheritance theft. With the records we have, it's simple, but it could get complicated. I don't mind being messy, I said, crossing my arms. I've had enough of them stepping all over me. I gave my mother a call. That night, I needed answers, whether she was complicit in this or just blindly trusting Brian. Hi, Mom, I said, my voice steady. Rebecca, she answered quickly, her tone still carrying the usual edge of annoyance. Are you calling to apologize? You know Brian is. Save it, I interrupted, cutting her off mid-sentence. I have some questions about Dad's inheritance, specifically about why Brian has been accessing my portion. There was a long pause on her end. What are you discussing? She finally asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Or was it guilt? I had a lawyer look into it, I said. For the past 5 years, Brian's been withdrawing money from my share. Thousands of dollars. Mom, did you know about this? Her hesitancy spoke volumes. Rebecca, it's not what you think, she said finally. Brian, he needed aid. He assured me he'd pay it back. My chest constricted, a mixture of rage and disbelief sweeping over me. You were aware? You knew he was taking from me. And you didn't say anything. I didn't believe that was stealing, she added defensively. It's family money. He was in a bad place and I trusted him to handle it correctly. I laughed fiercely, responsibly. He's been blowing it on holidays and gadgets while I've been working myself to the bone. And you let it happen. Rebecca, please, she pleaded. You don't comprehend. Brian has been having difficulties. I assumed you'd manage without it. It's not for you to decide that. I lost my temper. You gave him the money as if it were nothing, even though I trusted you to keep it safe. How deceived do I feel at the moment, do you know? I was no longer able to listen to her arguments. We're done talking, I said icily. My lawyer will be speaking to you. A flash of awareness swept over me as I hung up. I had allowed them to control me and shame me into obedience for years. No more. It was more than just taking back what was rightfully mine. It was about defending myself at last. That phone call had immediate repercussions. My phone was flooded with missed calls and anxious texts from my mother the next morning. In the voicemails, she alternated between being defensive and pleading. You can't do this, Rebecca. Brian had no malicious intent. Then, let's simply get together and discuss this as a family. You don't have to hire solicitors. However, I didn't answer. I had a feeling of mastery. The money was no longer the only consideration. It was about establishing limits and letting them know that I would no longer be their doormat. Naturally, Brian adopted a different strategy. I discovered a fresh wave of posts directed at me when I checked Facebook later that day. She first declines to assist her own brother. She is now threatening to sue her family for financial reasons. Greedy, self-centered, and callous. When it comes to money, some individuals truly display their actual selves. My jaw tensed as I gazed at the message. The same group of facilitators from before expressed their uninvited thoughts in the comments section. She sounds terrible. No matter what, family should come first. You're better off without her, Brian. And without hesitation, I forwarded my lawyer a screenshot that I had taken. I had another meeting with him the next day. He responded, We're filing both cases. The lawsuit for slander is simple. Regarding the inheritance, we have ample proof that it was stolen. However, you must be ready. Your connection with your mother will become even more strained as a result of this. I leaned forward with a grim face. It's already too stressed to fix. Come on, let's do it. He gave a nod. Another stuff. Brian will have to explain where the money went if this gets to court. Are you prepared for that? It could become unsightly. Something in me paused. Was I curious about the extent of this betrayal? However, I then reflected on the years I had given up for a family that never showed gratitude for me. I'm prepared. I spoke aggressively. My mother gave me another call that night. I picked Rebecca up this time. Her voice wavered as she spoke. I spoke with Brian. He gave me some information on the funds. I had no idea it was so nasty. He told you what? With a harsh tone, I asked. Her quiet was quite telling. Finally, she muttered, I'm sorry. I had no idea how much he had taken. I ought to have prevented him. I allowed her to continue even though her comments sounded empty. I will speak with him once again. We'll work it out. Don't take this to court, please. I take a deep breath and close my eyes. Mom, it's out of my control now. You ought to have considered this years ago. I was relieved and angry at the same time as I hung up. Although it was much too late to reverse the harm, she was beginning to realize the reality. My lawyer phoned me a week later with an update that took me entirely by surprise. We have been looking over more financial documents. His tone was calm yet serious as he started. As it happens, Brian has been using more than simply your inheritance. Additionally, he has been abusing several of your mother's accounts. I went cold. What are you saying? It appears that he has been using money that your mother put up for her retirement. He clarified that we discovered regular withdrawals that followed the same pattern as the ones he took out of your inheritance. I was momentarily at a loss for words. In spite of his shortcomings, my mother had been unyielding in her defense of Brian, and now he had also stolen from her. Is she aware? Finally, I asked. Not just yet, he said. However, This information will be revealed if we move forward with both instances. My thoughts were racing when I hung up. Even though I felt bad for my mother for helping Brian, I felt sick to my stomach at the prospect of her losing her retirement funds. I gave her mother a call later that night. I started studying my voice. It will not be pleasant to hear what I have to tell you. What is it? Her voice was tired as she inquired. I described what the attorney had found. It was deafeningly quiet on her end. My money was stolen by him. At last, she uttered a tremulous murmur. I softened my tone and responded, "Yes, Mom. You deserve to know, even if I didn't want to. Brian has been robbing us both." She reacted with a mixture of astonishment and destruction. Her voice broke as she continued, "I can't believe this. I had faith in him. I had complete faith in him. You ought not to have," I said softly. "You've been supporting him for years, even though I know you adore him. When there are no repercussions, this occurs." She started crying, and I felt pity for her for the first time, just as much as she had hurt me. She fell prey to Brian's self-centeredness as well. "Now, what should we do?" Through her tears, she inquired. We waited for the judicial proceedings to conclude. I spoke aggressively. "The money is no longer the only consideration here. It has to do with responsibility." The days that followed were stressful. I could feel the weight of the impending encounter bearing down on me as my lawyer submitted both cases. Although I knew it would be difficult, I also knew it was essential. I had let my mother and Brian use my generosity for years. However, I was defending myself this time. They needed to confront the repercussions of their behavior, regardless of the pain. The initial court date came sooner than I anticipated. As I sat in the courtroom, I had a mix of anxiety and excitement. For the years of entitlement, the thievery, and the way Brian portrayed me as the bad guy, I wanted justice. On the other hand, I was aware that this procedure would be unpleasant and bring the most sinister truths about our family to light. I became enraged at Brian's arrogant demeanor as he and my mother entered the courtroom. He dared to appear disinterested, as if this were just another annoyance in his life. But my mother seemed totally defeated. Her shoulders were stooped as if the weight of everything had finally caught up with her, and she averted her eyes from mine. The attorney meticulously presented the evidence. Black and white screenshots of the social media posts, bank statements, and transaction details were displayed. Every time my attorney talked, I noticed Brian moving uneasily in his chair, and Brian's tone was appropriately contemplative when he finally spoke. His voice was brimming with fake sincerity as he continued. "I didn't mean for things to get this far. Well, I was having trouble. The only reason I took the money was because I believed I could repay it. However, Rebecca has no idea what it's like to be in need of assistance. She has always been well organized." As I heard his justifications, my jaw tightened. The gadgets, the evenings out, and the trips were not explained by struggling. And despite his best efforts to portray himself as the victim, the facts were clear. My mother paused and looked anxiously at Brian when the court asked her to testify. At last, her voice wavered as she spoke. "I had faith in Brian," she said. "I had assumed that he would handle the money sensibly, but I had no idea how much he had taken or what he was doing with it. I was unaware of how deeply he had wounded Rebecca. Although her remarks were painful, they also had a hint of responsibility. She was admitting reality. I won the case in court. In addition to being compelled to pay back the money he had stolen, Brian and my mother were had to publicly apologize online as part of the settlement of the defamation action. It wasn't a flawless triumph. I was aware that Brian would not be able to repay his debt for years. Furthermore, even if the apology was heartfelt, the harm they had caused was not undone. However, it was a beginning. Brian glared at me as we walked out of the courthouse. "I hope all is well with you," he spit. I answered calmly, looking him in the eye without flinching. My mother followed. She started crying. Rebecca said, "I don't know how to make this right." "You begin by being truthful," I said, alongside me. "With Brian and with yourself. No more justifications." Slowly, she nodded. She had a sorrowful and guilty expression on her face. "I'll make an effort," she muttered. I sat in my flat that night and thought about all that had transpired. The struggle in court was ended, but the actual job was only getting started. Although I knew it would be difficult, I believed I had the strength to set limits with my family. Even though it was painful to see my mother and brother for who they truly were, I was relieved that I had at last defended myself. Life was strangely calm in the weeks after the court decision. My mother no longer bombarded me with texts and calls requesting that I help Brian or resolve their most recent problem. She appeared to have retreated as a result of the decision, or perhaps she was simply too ashamed to approach me. However, the quiet didn't seem meaningless. It was peaceful. My phone rang one afternoon when I was at the kitchen table going over my invoices. My mother's name briefly displayed on the caller ID. I thought about leaving it on voicemail, but I had to answer for some reason. I said in a neutral tone, "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Rebecca," she said, a little hesitantly. "I've been considering every aspect of the bequest. The case in court. Brian." Uncertain of where this was headed, I waited. She went on. "At first, I didn't want to believe it, but I can't ignore the truth anymore. Regarding him, you were correct. About me. I allowed him to take advantage of you and watched as he caused you pain. I'm so sorry." I wasn't prepared for how hard her remarks affected me. I had hoped for an apology like this for years. I wasn't sure how to feel, though, now that it was here. "I appreciate you expressing that." Finally, I said, "Mom, it's not simply about saying sorry. The goal is to change. I've allowed you and Brian to treat me like I'm unimportant for years. That must end." She let out a sigh. "I am aware that I have been considering ways to improve. I just hope we can work things out before it's too late." I took a while to reply. "There is yet time." Eventually, I responded, "But it will take time." Brian, meantime, had been radio quiet. A part of me questioned whether he was planning retaliation. However, my attorney advised me that he could not financially retaliate because of the agreements. I knew better than to put my confidence in him, though. I was notified one day that Brian had made a post on Facebook. I opened it against my better judgment. I'm getting ready for more hate mail. Rather, I came upon a post that was very different from his typical tone. "I would like to express my regret to everyone I have harmed, particularly my sister Rebecca. I'm trying to make up for the mistakes I did that cannot be undone. I'm hoping she'll forgive me, but I know it will take time." I couldn't decide if I should laugh or cry. Was this only a show, or was he genuinely attempting to accept responsibility? In any case, I chose not to answer. I was not prepared to reopen that door. Not quite yet. I started to reconstruct my life in the months that followed. I pushed myself into my work, picked up some abandoned hobbies, and even began organizing a long overdue trip. My mother and I continued to have a functional but brittle relationship. She tried to give me a call once a week, not to berate me or make demands, but to find out how I was doing. Even though it was a tiny step, it felt important. Regarding Brian, I avoided him. He had been ordered by the court to repay the money he had stolen, but I knew I wouldn't see the majority of it for years. I was okay with that. I wasn't waiting for him to change his ways. The most important thing was that I had regained my authority. A few months later, I was enjoying a cup of tea while sitting on my balcony and seeing the distant twinkling city lights. For the first time in a long, long time, my family's incessant requests were not on my mind. Things have altered in my life that I never would have imagined. My shoulders were no longer burdened by the continual stress. Instead, I felt a calmness I was unaware I had. I had always believed that defending myself would entail losing my family and my sense of identity. Instead, it had provided me with what I had been looking for the entire time: calm. Although it was taking a while, my mom and I had started to mend our connection. She continued to give me a weekly call, usually to tell me about little things like her garden or a book she was reading. It seemed as though the burden of hidden expectations had finally been lifted from these discussions. Brian, on the other hand, kept his distance. I was grateful for the reparations, but I didn't rely on them, and his court-ordered payments came in irregularly. In actuality, I might have gone on without his money or apology. I had come to appreciate myself and learned to stand on my own, not because I was angry or spiteful, and it was sufficient. Thinking back on all that had transpired, I came to the conclusion that my family had not undergone the biggest transformation. I had it. I had been engaged in a vicious cycle for years of looking to those who simply appeared to take me for granted, for acceptance. I had gone above and above to provide for my family, putting my personal security and happiness at risk. However, defending myself, even when it was difficult, had led me down a different route. A tiny consolation was my mother's hesitant attempts to mend our connection. In her own way, she was attempting to put things right, but I still didn't have complete faith in her. There were hints of the mother I had imagined her to be. someone who valued me not only for what I could provide, but also for who I was. But Brian was another matter entirely. I wasn't prepared to let him back into my life, and his public apologies sounded insincere. I might be able to forgive him in the future. However, it was not that day. The most important thing was that I had learned to respect my own time and work, and to set boundaries. There were times when I doubted myself, and it wasn't always easy. However, I now realized that it was always the appropriate thing to do to defend my value. I was quietly proud when I took a drink of my tea. Even if my family may not have changed entirely, I had, and that was sufficient. I had worked hard to gain this tranquility, and I wasn't going to let it go.